No one understood the Italian mafia boss until the flight attendant replied in Italian and shocked everyone. Hey friends, before we start, don't forget to subscribe, like this video, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Your support truly means a lot and helps me keep sharing more heartfelt stories with you. Now sit comfortably and let's get into it. Milan's first-class lounge buzzed with the usual hum of business chatter and polite greetings. But when Leonardo Rocco entered, the air shifted, charged with an unspoken tension that immediately swept through the room. He moved with the kind of controlled power that came from years of being untouchable, a man who commanded not just respect, but fear. The sharp silence that followed his arrival was instinctive, as though the elite passengers instinctively recognized the presence of a predator. He was a towering figure over 6 feet tall, his tailored black suit fitting him like a second skin. Silver-streaked hair, combed back with immaculate precision, caught the light as he passed through the lounge. His face was a map of battles fought, not only with the world but with himself, as the scar above his left eyebrow could attest to. His piercing hazel eyes scanned the room, sharp and calculating, looking for nothing in particular, but aware of everything. The room parted like water around him, people instinctively stepping aside. No one spoke to him, no one made eye contact. His reputation had preceded him, and it was enough to ensure he remained untouched in a place where status was everything. His demeanor was stoic, every movement precise, as if he were always a step ahead, calculating the cost of every word and every gesture. His very presence seemed to demand that the world fall silent, and it did. He spoke only Italian, his voice a deep, measured tone that was almost musical in its cadence. It was a tool, one he wielded like a weapon, using it as a barrier to keep the world at arm's length. Leonardo Rocco had a language of his own, one that made sure no one got too close, no one dared to truly understand him. He approached the check-in desk, speaking rapidly to the attendant in Italian. The young woman fumbled with her words, not quite understanding the urgency in his speech, but she nodded politely, not daring to ask for clarification. No one dared question him. Gabriella Dante stood at the opposite end of the lounge, quietly observing the scene as the passengers shuffled about. She was 28, with olive skin, brown almond-shaped eyes, and dark hair neatly tied in a bun. Her uniform was perfectly pressed, the navy blue fabric accentuating her poised, graceful figure. There was a calmness to her presence, an air of quiet confidence that came from years of navigating difficult situations without ever breaking a sweat. As a flight attendant on the international routes, Gabriella had seen all kinds of passengers, from celebrities to businessmen, but there was something about Leonardo Rocco that unsettled her. She had heard whispers about the man, rumors of his connections to the Italian mafia, his ruthless reputation that sent a chill down the spine of even the most hardened individuals. But Gabriella, despite her awareness, was never one to be intimidated. She had her own reasons for keeping her head high. When her assignment came through, she wasn't surprised to see his name on the manifest. She had been on enough international flights to know when a VIP, or in this case, a dangerous man, would be boarding. But she couldn't shake the feeling that today would be different. The flight to New York began as any other. The crew ran through their usual procedures, welcoming passengers aboard, ensuring safety measures were in place. As Gabriella made her way through the cabin, she noticed Leonardo seated in first class, his back perfectly straight, his eyes never leaving the window. His stoic expression remained unbroken as the plane began its ascent, leaving the noise of the airport far behind. However, as the plane crossed over the Atlantic and hit an unexpected patch of turbulence, things quickly escalated. The fasten seatbelt sign illuminated, and the smooth flight turned into a chaotic, shaking mess. The senior flight attendant, Margaret, was in the middle of preparing the drinks cart when Leonardo suddenly rose from his seat, his hand gripping the armrest tightly. His face, usually composed, now showed signs of frustration. "Signor Rocco," Margaret said, approaching him with her usual air of calm, "is there anything I can do?" Leonardo muttered something urgently in Italian, but Margaret, unfamiliar with the language, could not make sense of his rapid speech. His words were lost in the turbulence, his voice rising with a sense of panic that seemed at odds with his usually controlled demeanor. She glanced at him, confused, as he repeated the request, speaking faster this time. Gabriella, who was on her break in the economy galley, overheard the commotion. She stepped forward, her heels clicking against the aisle as she approached the front. With a quick glance at Margaret, Gabriella knew what had happened. The medication Leonardo needed was in his carry-on, and the senior attendant couldn't understand the urgency. Gabriella's heart raced as she recognized the situation, the knowledge that this moment would change everything flashing through her mind. Without thinking, she moved toward Leonardo's seat. She spoke softly, but with perfect clarity in Italian. "He needs his heart medication from the overhead bin. Third row, black leather bag." The cabin fell into an uneasy silence as Leonardo's piercing hazel eyes locked onto Gabriella's. For the first time in decades, someone had understood him, truly understood him. His shock was momentary, his usual control slipping just for a moment. His lips parted as if to speak, but no words came out. The world outside the plane seemed to disappear as his gaze never left Gabriella's. The other flight attendants looked on, stunned by her fluency. Margaret, who had been nervously wringing her hands, watched as Gabriella effortlessly translated Leonardo's request. She had known Gabriella was Italian-American, but the flawless delivery, the Tuscan accent, was unexpected. For Leonardo, the tension in the air shifted. He had never intended to let anyone see past the carefully constructed wall of isolation he'd built over the years. But this woman, this flight attendant, had shattered it with a few simple words. Her voice, calm yet assertive, had reached him in a way nothing else had. It was as though for the first time in years, someone was able to hear the man behind the reputation. Gabriella noticed the subtle shift in Leonardo's expression, the brief flicker of emotion in his usually cold eyes. It was fleeting, but enough for her to feel its impact. She knew, without a doubt, that this was no ordinary man. He wasn't just another passenger on her flight. He was a force, a shadow that loomed over everything he touched. Yet in that moment she saw him not as a mafia boss, but as a man who had been hiding behind a veil of silence for far too long. As Leonardo sat back, his eyes still fixed on Gabriella, the flight resumed its course, the turbulence settling into the steady hum of the engines. The moment lingered, heavy with meaning, as both of them were left with the unspoken understanding that this interaction was only the beginning. Neither could have known then how deeply their lives were about to intertwine. The plane continued its journey through the skies, but for Gabriella, the world outside had changed. Leonardo Rocco, the Italian mafia boss, no longer seemed like an untouchable figure. Instead, he was just a man, looking for someone to understand him, and in that fleeting moment, Gabriella had given him exactly that. As the flight progressed, Gabriella found herself lost in thought, her mind replaying the look in Leonardo's eyes. She had broken a rule, crossed a boundary that she hadn't even known existed, but she also knew that this was just the beginning. This flight, this encounter, would lead to something far deeper than either of them could have anticipated. The stage was set, and the next step in their journey would unfold in ways neither of them could have predicted. The turbulence was far from over. The flight from Milan to New York continued smoothly after the turbulence had subsided. The cabin lights flickered back to their normal dim ambiance, and the steady hum of the engines became a background lullaby, coaxing most passengers into quiet relaxation. Yet for Gabriella, the stillness around her couldn't quell the growing thoughts in her mind. The moment she had shared with Leonardo Rocco, a moment where the world had shifted, kept replaying in her thoughts. each instant revealing new layers. As she walked down the aisle to check on the passengers, her gaze occasionally flickered back to the first-class cabin where Leonardo sat, still reading his papers, his demeanor unchanged. The sharp lines of his suit, the stoic set of his jaw, everything about him screamed power, but it was his eyes. The piercing, unreadable hazel eyes that truly unsettled her. There was something in them, something that hinted at a man who was far more complicated than his reputation. Something that made him, despite everything, human. Gabriella knew she needed to focus. She had her duties to attend to. But as the plane flew over the Atlantic, Gabriella couldn't help but think about her own connection to the language she had spoken so effortlessly just moments before. She leaned against the galley, absent-mindedly checking on the drink inventory, when the memories of her grandmother came rushing back. Gabriella Dante had grown up with the rhythm of Italian spoken in her home, though not in the way many would assume. She was born and raised in New York City, an American through and through. Her father, a widower for most of Gabriella's life, had been a modest man, an accountant who never spoke much about his past. But it was Gabriella's grandmother, Nonna Rosetta, who had been the center of her world. Nonna Rosetta had come to the United States from Tuscany as a young woman, bringing with her a wealth of family traditions, recipes, and most importantly, the beauty of the Italian language. From the time Gabriella was old enough to understand, her nonna had taught her Italian, not as a tool for communication, but as a bridge to their heritage. They spent summers in the rolling hills of Tuscany, where Gabriella learned not only the language but the soul of it, the cadence, the flow, the music of it. Nonna would tell stories about her youth, about life in Italy during the war, and the deep connection that family and language held. But it wasn't until years later that Gabriella understood why those summers meant so much. She was only 22 when her nonna was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, a cruel illness that slowly took away the vibrant woman who had once been so full of life. The memories of the old country faded first, and then slowly the words she had taught Gabriella slipped away. In the final days of her nonna's life, when her mind was clouded and fragmented, her last coherent words to Gabriella were simple, spoken in Italian. Promettimi, Gabriella, che non dimenticherai mai la lingua. Promettimi che manterrai viva la nostra eredità. Promise me, Gabriella, that you will never forget the language. Promise me you will keep our heritage alive. It was those words that had driven Gabriella to learn the language with such passion. She hadn't done it for career advancement or because she needed another skill for her resume. No, it was a promise to her grandmother, a promise she kept long after Nonna had passed away. Gabriella learned Italian because it was a connection to a piece of her that was lost, a bridge to a past she could no longer touch. And every time she spoke Italian, she felt close to the woman who had shaped her, the woman who had made her feel proud of her roots. As the flight continued, Gabriella moved through the cabin, performing her usual checks, but her mind kept returning to the encounter with Leonardo. She had been trained to stay professional, to not let the weight of a passenger's reputation affect how she served them, but this was different. It wasn't just his reputation that had captured her attention, it was the way he had looked at her, the way his cold mask had cracked for just a moment when she spoke Italian. She had seen it in his eyes, an unspoken understanding, a flicker of something that wasn't just about business or power. Leonardo wasn't just a mafia boss. He was a man who had lived through something tragic, something that had left deep scars on his soul. Gabriella didn't know what it was, but she could sense it, and that made him even more enigmatic to her. She found herself watching him more closely over the next few hours. Every time their paths crossed, she couldn't help but notice the way he held himself, always composed, always distant. There was a weight to him, something that radiated from his presence. And his eyes. Gabriella couldn't forget the way they had locked onto hers, the way they held an ocean of sadness, of regret. That seemed to speak louder than any words could. For the first time in years, Leonardo had met someone who understood his language, who hadn't been afraid to step into his world, even if only for a brief moment. Gabriella's fluency had pierced the wall of isolation he had built so carefully, and though it had been a small gesture, it had unsettled him. As she moved through the cabin, she thought about the man behind the persona. What had shaped him? What had caused a man like him to isolate himself in this way? She knew he wasn't just the ruthless figure that the world made him out to be. There was more to him. There had to be. Gabriella had seen that in his eyes. She just didn't know what it meant yet. Leonardo Rocco had been a man of few words for most of his life. He had learned early that words were just tools for manipulation, and that real power came not from what you said, but from what you controlled. His empire had been built on fear, on ruthless decisions, and on the kind of isolation that kept him untouchable. He had kept people at arm's length for decades, speaking only Italian, ensuring that the world around him never understood the true weight of his burden. For years he had used his language as a weapon, a shield. His mafia connections, his violent past, all of it had been shrouded in secrecy. He had no need for friends or family. At least that's what he told himself. He had learned that connections only made you vulnerable, and vulnerability, he had learned the hard way, was the fastest way to lose everything. But when Gabriella Dante had spoken to him in perfect Italian, something inside him had shifted. It wasn't just the fluency of her words. It was the intention behind them. Gabriella wasn't trying to gain something from him. She wasn't trying to use him or manipulate him. She had simply understood. She had simply answered him in the way he had hoped someone would for so long. She wasn't like the others. She hadn't been afraid of him. No, she had shown him respect, not through fear, but through understanding. And that was something that Leonardo had not expected, nor had he wanted. But in that moment, when she had stepped forward to translate his words, everything had changed. He had seen something in her that was rare. Gabriella Dante was a mystery, and for the first time in years, Leonardo Rocco found himself intrigued. He had always been in control. His world had been one of calculated moves and perfect distance. But Gabriella had cut through that distance with one simple act of kindness, and now he couldn't shake the thought of her. Leonardo had spent decades building his empire with his own hands, using the language of power to ensure that no one could ever truly get close. He had seen what happened to those who allowed others in. He had lost his wife and daughter to the cruelty of the world, and their deaths had left a scar deeper than anything physical. The regret he carried was a constant companion, one that he had never spoken of to anyone, not even those closest to him. Speaking only Italian had been his way of keeping the world at bay. It was a choice, and it was a prison. For years he had isolated himself in this way, hiding behind his language, hiding behind his power. But when Gabriella had spoken, something inside him had begun to unravel. He didn't know what it was about her, but there was something in the way she had looked at him, not with fear, not with reverence, but with something real, something human, and that scared him more than anything else. He had spent years making himself invisible, but Gabriella had seen him. She had seen through the walls he had built, and for the first time in a long while, Leonardo wasn't sure if he wanted those walls back up. As the flight continued, Leonardo remained in his seat, his mind racing. Gabriella's words echoed in his thoughts. He had always believed that the isolation he had built around himself was necessary for survival, but now he wasn't so sure. Something had changed in him, something that he couldn't control. And it all started with a flight attendant who had dared to understand him in a way no one else ever had. He glanced at her from across the cabin, their eyes meeting once more, and for the briefest moment, he allowed himself to wonder, what would it be like to let someone in? Gabriella was used to the silence that settled over her father's house when she arrived home after a long flight. The quiet was always the same, with only the low hum of the television filling the space. But tonight, the silence felt different. As she stepped into the modest apartment she had shared with her father for the past few years, A strange weight pressed down on her chest, an unfamiliar sense of foreboding. The once comforting space now felt like a reminder of the heavy burdens she carried, burdens that seemed to get heavier with each passing day. Her father, Marco Dante, was sitting in his favorite armchair by the window, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the room. His eyes were tired, the years of battling early-onset Parkinson's disease showing in the deep lines on his face. He had once been a strong man, full of life and laughter, but now he was a shadow of his former self. The tremors in his hands had grown worse, and his movements, once fluid and precise, were slow and hesitant. His condition had progressed far beyond what Gabriella had hoped, and it seemed that each time she returned home, she saw a little less of the man she had once admired. "Dad?" Gabriella's voice was soft, as though afraid of disturbing the stillness. Marco looked up at her, offering a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Hello, Gabriella. How was your flight?" She walked over and kissed his cheek, her fingers brushing against the rough stubble he had neglected to shave. "It was fine, just a little turbulence over the Atlantic." She paused, studying him closely. "You're looking a little pale today, Dad. Are you feeling okay?" Marco gave a weak shrug, his hands trembling slightly as he set down the remote control. "Same as always, nothing to worry about." Gabriella's heart tightened. He had always been the strong one, the rock she could lean on. But now the roles were reversed. She was the one holding everything together, the one who had to put her dreams on hold to care for him. It hadn't been easy. Being a flight attendant meant long hours, odd schedules, and time away from home. But Gabriella couldn't bring herself to choose anything else. Her father needed her, and she couldn't bear the thought of leaving him alone. It had always been her family first, even at the expense of her own career. She had a master's degree in international law, and when she had graduated, there had been countless opportunities for prestigious jobs with Interpol or top law firms. But Gabriella had turned them all down. She had chosen flying, choosing to be closer to her father, choosing to be the daughter who didn't leave, who stayed to care for him. The decision hadn't been easy, and at times it weighed heavily on her. The constant pull between duty and desire, between family and self. The following morning, Gabriella awoke to an unexpected call. The phone rang loudly in the stillness of her apartment, pulling her from a restless sleep. She glanced at the screen, an unknown number. At first, she hesitated. It was still early, and she had only just returned from her flight, but something told her she needed to answer. "Hello?" she mumbled, rubbing her eyes. "Ms. Dante, this is Dr. Richard Heller from the Swiss Medical Clinic. I'm calling regarding your father's treatment." Gabriella's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't heard of any appointments being set up. "I'm sorry. I think you have the wrong person," she began, but the doctor's calm voice interrupted her. "No, I don't believe I do. We've received confirmation that Mr. Marco Dante has been registered for cutting-edge Parkinson's treatment at our facility. His treatment has been fully covered by a benefactor." Gabriella sat up straighter, confusion washing over her. "What do you mean, fully covered? Who would do that?" Dr. Heller paused for a moment before replying, his tone serious. "I'm afraid I can't share that information, but I can assure you that your father's treatment will be administered immediately. All costs have been settled." Gabriella was silent, the enormity of the statement sinking in. "But 150,000, that's a lot of money. Why would someone do this for us?" The doctor's voice softened. "I'm afraid I can't provide the details, Miss Dante, but rest assured the treatment is legitimate, and your father's medical care is in good hands. You'll receive more information when you arrive at the clinic." Gabriella's mind was spinning. She was grateful, of course, overwhelmed with relief at the thought of her father receiving the best possible care. But there was also a nagging sense of unease. Who was behind this? Why would someone, a stranger no less, choose to help her father in this way? As the conversation ended, Gabriella sat still, staring at her phone. The mystery of the benefactor hung in the air like an unspoken question, one she couldn't yet answer. But a part of her already knew the answer. even if she couldn't admit it to herself. She thought of the man she had met on the plane, the mafia boss, Leonardo Rocco. The moment when she had spoken to him in flawless Italian, when the world around them had momentarily shifted. Could he have arranged this? The thought seemed too absurd to entertain, but the timing was uncanny. She couldn't shake the feeling that he was somehow involved, though the idea seemed impossible. Why would someone like him help her family, someone so far removed from his world? That same day, when Gabriella returned to work for her next flight, she found herself thinking about the call again. As she prepped for takeoff, her eyes drifted toward first class, where Leonardo sat, looking as composed as ever. His cold eyes met hers briefly before he returned to his papers, but Gabriella couldn't ignore the flutter of recognition. She couldn't help but wonder if the mysterious benefactor was, in fact, the man who had shattered the isolation around her the day before. As the flight continued, her mind kept wandering back to the question, why? Why would someone like Leonardo Rocco, someone who had everything, who commanded entire empires, who lived in the shadows, care about her father's treatment? It didn't make sense. Gabriella could barely focus on her duties. The question gnawed at her, and she knew, deep down, that this was no coincidence. Leonardo's involvement, if it was true, meant that everything was about to change. She wasn't just a flight attendant anymore. No, now she was entangled in a world far more dangerous and complicated than she could have ever imagined. When the flight finally landed, Gabriella received a text message from an unknown number. "I trust your father's treatment will go smoothly. Please take care of him, Gabriella. His recovery is important. I look forward to seeing you again soon." The message, without a name, was chilling. It had to be Leonardo. But why? Why was he doing this, and how far was she willing to let this strange, dangerous connection go? As she stared at the screen, her heart pounded in her chest. The walls she had so carefully built around her were beginning to crumble. And for the first time in years, Gabriella didn't know if that was a good thing. The mystery of Leonardo's involvement lingered in her thoughts as she boarded her next flight. She could feel the weight of it pressing down on her, the sense that the world she had known was shifting beneath her feet. But Gabriella wasn't the type to shy away from questions, especially when it came to her family. She had made a promise to her grandmother to never forget where she came from, and she wasn't about to break that promise now. One thing was certain: her life was no longer just about flying or her father's health. It had become about a man, Leonardo Rocco, and the shadows he cast. Shadows that now seemed to be following her, closing in with each passing day. The next time she crossed paths with him, Gabriella knew the answers would come, but whether she was ready for them was another matter entirely. The hum of the engines reverberated through the aircraft, its rhythmic pulse blending with the occasional clink of beverage carts and the soft murmur of passengers. Gabriella moved silently through the cabin, her steps measured and deliberate. It had been a long flight from New York, and now, nearing the end of it, the late-night atmosphere had a weight to it. The city lights below twinkled like a constellation scattered across the darkened sea. It was on this flight, one that should have been routine, that Gabriella found herself caught in the web of something far deeper than she had ever expected. She wasn't quite sure how it happened, but the interactions with Leonardo Rocco had left a mark on her. The man was like no one she had ever met. His presence was a paradox, a predator disguised in a suit, a ruler of a kingdom built on shadows, but beneath that cold veneer, something else lingered. A man who had been broken by life's cruelties. A man who could command armies but had never been able to command his own happiness. Tonight the flight was mostly quiet, save for the occasional murmur from the first-class cabin. As she walked past the velvet curtains that separated it from the rest of the plane, Gabriella stole a glance at Leonardo. His seat was reclined slightly, and his eyes were focused on the documents in front of him, papers that seemed to demand his undivided attention. But Gabriella had learned enough about him to know that he was never truly focused on the task at hand. His mind was elsewhere, always somewhere beyond the reach of his empire. When their eyes met, She felt that familiar pull. He was staring at her with an intensity that made her feel both vulnerable and empowered. "Gabriella," he said, his voice deep but with a hint of weariness. "Come sit for a moment." She hesitated. It wasn't a request, but a command, though one that felt more like an invitation than a demand. She glanced at the other flight attendants who were busy preparing the cabin for landing and made her way toward Leonardo's seat. As she sat across from him, the quiet hum of the airplane seemed to fade into the background, leaving just the two of them in their own small world. Leonardo's piercing gaze was still fixed on her, but there was something different in it now, a weariness, an emotion he had been keeping hidden. "You look tired," Gabriella said gently, unable to ignore the burden in his eyes. It was impossible not to notice the weight of the past in the lines of his face, in the way his shoulders sagged slightly, as if the world rested on them. Leonardo let out a sigh, and for the first time since they had met, he looked less like a mafia boss and more like a man, raw, exposed, and vulnerable. "You've seen it, haven't you? The walls I've built around myself, the cold, the distance, the reason I speak only in Italian when I'm in public." Gabriella nodded, unsure where this conversation was going, but feeling that something important was unfolding. "You use the language to keep people at a distance," she said, her voice soft, understanding. "It's your wall." Leonardo's gaze darkened, and for a moment it felt as though the weight of the years was too much to bear. He leaned back in his seat, his hands clasped together as if holding on to something fragile. "You're right. But it's more than that, Gabriella. I speak Italian because it's the only thing that keeps me tethered to the past. It's the last thing I have left of them." "Them?" Gabriella asked, her voice gentle. "Who are you talking about?" He closed his eyes for a moment, the intensity of his sorrow pressing down on his chest. "My wife, my daughter." His voice cracked slightly, and for the first time Gabriella heard the man behind the mafia boss, the man who had lost everything. Leonardo paused as though gathering the strength to continue. 20 years ago, we were on a plane together. I had just closed a major deal, one that would have expanded my empire. I was focused on that, on making sure everything was perfect. And then just before we landed, the plane hit severe turbulence. There was a mechanical failure. The cabin depressurized. My wife and daughter... He swallowed hard. "They died in the crash." Gabriella felt a chill run through her. "Oh my God. Leonardo, I'm so sorry." She reached out instinctively, but he didn't move, keeping his hands clasped together tightly, as though holding on to his emotions. He didn't meet her eyes. "I was in the cockpit when the emergency hit. I was too busy with business to be with them. I wasn't there when they needed me the most. My last words to them were in Italian. After the crash, I could never speak English again without hearing their voices, hearing the guilt in my own. So I chose Italian. It was the language they understood. It was all I had left of them." Gabriella sat in silence, absorbing the gravity of his words. For the first time, she saw the man beneath the mafia boss, the man who had built an empire on pain and loss, the man who carried a burden so heavy it almost consumed him. She had known that his coldness was a shield, but now she understood why it had been built. It was a shield against the unbearable guilt that gnawed at him every day. "You've lived with that guilt all these years," Gabriella said softly. "It's been with you every moment, hasn't it?" Leonardo nodded. "Yes, and in a way, it's what has kept me alive. The guilt, the need to atone, to build something that makes me worthy of their memory. But at the same time, it's also what's made me incapable of feeling anything real." His eyes met hers, and for the first time, there was no mask, no facade. There was only raw honesty. "Until you." Gabriella felt a sharp pang in her chest as his words sank in. She wasn't sure if it was sympathy or something else, something deeper that stirred within her. Leonardo's sorrow was palpable, but so was his strength. He had built an empire from the ashes of his grief, and that empire had made him untouchable. Yet here he was, sharing his deepest pain with her, a flight attendant who had only crossed his path by chance. She didn't know what to say, but she knew that in that moment, she wasn't just talking to a mafia boss. She was talking to a man who had lost everything and was trying to rebuild himself from the ruins. "Leonardo," Gabriella began, her voice trembling slightly, "I don't know what to say. I can't even imagine the pain you've carried, but I want you to know that you're not alone in this. You've done things you regret, I'm sure, but you don't have to live in the past forever. You can still change." Leonardo looked at her, his eyes filled with an intensity that almost made her look away. "I can't change what I've done, Gabriella. I can't undo the years I've spent building this empire, but I want to try. For you." Her heart beat faster at his words. She had always known that their connection wasn't just about curiosity or fleeting moments. It was something deeper, something that neither of them fully understood. But what did it mean? Could she walk away from everything she knew and follow him into a world that was built on fear and violence? Leonardo's voice broke through her thoughts. "I want to show you everything, Gabriella. I want you to understand who I am, everything I've built, and everything I've destroyed to protect it. I'm giving you a choice. You can leave now and forget everything that's happened between us, or you can stay. But if you stay, you'll be part of this world, the good, the bad, the ugly, and once you see what I'm about to show you, there's no going back." Gabriella felt a lump form in her throat. She had already crossed so many lines by getting close to him, but this was something entirely different. She wasn't just being asked to stay, she was being asked to understand. And that understanding would change everything. Without speaking a word, Gabriella nodded, her decision clear. "I'll stay," she said, her voice steady, despite the storm of emotions swirling within her. "Show me everything, Leonardo. I need to know." Leonardo's expression softened for a moment, a flicker of something vulnerable flashing in his eyes. Then his usual stoic mask returned. "Then come with me. I'm taking you to my villa on Lake Como. You need to see the truth." As the plane cruised toward its destination, Gabriella knew that her life was about to change forever. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with danger and secrets, but she had made her choice. She would walk through this door, whatever it meant on the other side. She didn't know where it would lead, but she couldn't turn back now. Leonardo had opened up to her in a way he had never done with anyone else, and now it was her turn to see the world he had built, the empire forged in the fires of grief and power. The question remained, would she stay by his side, or would the darkness be too much to bear? The car ride from the airport to Leonardo's villa on Lake Como felt surreal. Gabriella sat in the back seat, the weight of the world pressing down on her shoulders, but her thoughts were lost in the hum of the engine and the scenic landscape outside the window. The last few hours had unraveled so much. Leonardo's confessions, his invitation to step into his world, the decision she had made to follow him. There was no turning back now. The sprawling villa loomed ahead as they pulled into the private estate, its imposing stone walls and vast grounds hinting at the wealth and secrecy contained within. The air was different here, thick with both the beauty of the surroundings and the weight of the empire that Leonardo had built. As she stepped out of the car, Gabriella couldn't help but feel a mix of awe and apprehension. This place was not just a mansion, it was a symbol of everything Leonardo represented, the power, the control, and the isolation that came with it. Leonardo was already waiting at the door, his back to her, his figure framed by the open doorway. He didn't need to say anything, his presence was enough to command attention. As she approached him, the cool night air seemed to press in from all sides, the lake shimmering faintly in the distance. "This way," Leonardo said simply, gesturing toward the grand entrance. His voice, though calm, held an edge of authority that Gabriella had come to expect. Yet beneath that exterior, she could see something else, something vulnerable that he was doing his best to hide. The moment they entered the villa, Gabriella was struck by the contrast between the exterior opulence and the starkness of what lay inside. The marble floors were polished to a high shine, the furniture elegant yet sparse. There was a sense of coldness to the house, not just in temperature but in atmosphere. It felt like a place meant to house secrets, dark, dangerous secrets. Leonardo led her down a long hallway, past rooms filled with rich tapestries and antique furniture, until they reached a door at the end of the corridor. He opened it without hesitation, revealing a private study. The room was large and dominated by a massive wooden desk, its surface cluttered with papers, contracts, and files. The walls were lined with shelves filled with books and more documents, some old and yellowed, others crisp and freshly printed. "This is where everything happens," Leonardo said, his voice almost reverent as he gestured to the piles of paperwork that seemed to consume the room. "Here is where I've built my empire, and here is where everything comes crashing down if you choose to walk away." Gabriella stepped into the room, her eyes scanning the various files and contracts laid out before her. The air felt heavy, thick with the weight of 1,000 decisions that had been made behind closed doors. The contracts weren't just for legitimate business deals, they were for things much darker. She could see it in the way the words were written. Code phrases, cryptic notes, references to names she didn't recognize but knew instinctively were not meant to be uncovered. These were the inner workings of Leonardo's world, the side of him that no one ever saw. One file caught her eye, its red seal unmistakable. Elimination orders. She opened it carefully, her heart pounding in her chest as she scanned the pages, filled with details of people whose lives had been taken, some for reasons that seemed trivial, others for reasons far more calculated. She flipped through more files, each one more damning than the last. Money laundering schemes, territory disputes, the destruction of families who had crossed him. The weight of what she was seeing hit her like a punch to the stomach. The lives destroyed, the innocent people caught in the web of power that Leonardo had spun. It was all here, in black and white. Hours passed as Gabriella sifted through the files, her mind racing. The truth was undeniable. Leonardo was not the man she had once imagined. He was not simply a powerful, ruthless figure. He was the orchestrator of pain, the man who had made choices that had shattered the lives of countless others in the pursuit of his empire. And now, here she was, seeing it all laid bare before her. But amidst the horror of what she was reading, there was something else, a flicker of something that couldn't be ignored. It was the way he had opened up to her earlier, the vulnerability he had shown when he confessed his past, the raw honesty in his voice. She wasn't sure what to make of it. Was it possible for a man like him to change? Could he truly want redemption, or was it just another ploy to manipulate her, to pull her deeper into his world? Leonardo stood in the doorway, watching Gabriella as she read through the documents. His posture was stiff, his arms crossed, but there was something different in the way he stood, an edge to his usual control, a hesitation in his every move. For the first time, he wasn't commanding her attention. Instead, he was waiting for her to decide. He knew what she was seeing. He knew the weight of it, the darkness that came with the power he had built. But he couldn't bring himself to apologize for it, not now. What was the point? The choices had been made long ago. The empire had been built, and now all he could do was wait for Gabriella to decide whether she could accept him, despite it all. Gabriella finally set the file down and stood up, her back to him. She felt a lump form in her throat, her thoughts swirling in a storm of confusion and uncertainty. She had come here looking for answers, but what she had found was far more than she had expected. Leonardo took a step forward, his voice breaking the silence. "You've seen it all. You know who I am now, what I've done, what I've built." His tone was matter-of-fact, but there was a tremor beneath it, a hint of something that sounded like fear. She turned to face him, her gaze unwavering. "You're showing me these hoping I'll leave, but that's not your choice. It's mine." For a moment, Leonardo didn't speak. He simply stood there, his eyes locking onto hers with a quiet intensity. The silence between them felt charged, heavy with meaning. Then, for the first time in 30 years, Leonardo's facade cracked. A single tear slid down his cheek, the weight of it far heavier than any of the empire-building decisions he had made. Gabriella's heart wrenched at the sight, and despite everything she had read, despite the darkness of the empire he had created, she found herself moving toward him. She didn't excuse what he had done, didn't pretend it wasn't there, but in that moment she saw him for what he truly was, a man, a broken man carrying the burden of his past. He wiped the tear away quickly, as if embarrassed by the moment of weakness. But Gabriella didn't look away. "You don't have to carry this alone," she said softly, her voice full of understanding. "But you also don't get to choose for me. I have to make my own choice." Leonardo nodded slowly, his face unreadable. "Then what will it be?" His voice was barely a whisper, thick with the weight of years spent hiding behind walls. Gabriella took a deep breath. She knew the answer. She had already made it, even if she hadn't fully realized it yet. "I'll stay, but not because of you. Not because of your empire." She paused, meeting his gaze with an unwavering look. "I'll stay because I want to understand the man behind the empire. I want to know who you are beyond all this. And if that means we have to walk through the darkness together, then so be it." For a long moment, neither of them moved. Leonardo stood there, his heart pounding in his chest, and for the first time he didn't feel the weight of the empire pressing down on him. In its place was something new, something raw, something human. Leonardo stepped closer, his gaze softening as he studied Gabriella. "You have no idea what you're getting into," he said, his voice low, almost regretful. "I do," she replied, her voice steady. "I've seen the cost. I know the danger." She took a step forward, her eyes never leaving his. "But I also know that you're more than the empire you've built. You're more than the man you've been." Leonardo's lips twitched, as though he were about to speak, but no words came. Instead, he reached out and gently took her hand, his grip firm but not forceful. "Then we will walk this path together," he said quietly. "But understand this, there is no going back. Once you step into this world, you cannot leave." Gabriella nodded, feeling the weight of his words, but also the weight of the decision she had already made. "I understand, and I'm not afraid." And with that, Leonardo finally allowed himself to breathe, a breath that felt like freedom for the first time in years. The sun had barely set, casting long shadows across the quiet street in the modest neighborhood where Gabriella had grown up. Her father, Marco, had always preferred the simplicity of their small home, a place where they could forget about the world's complexities, even if just for a while. After spending the day with him, helping with some light chores, making sure he took his medication, Gabriella had decided to leave for the night. It was routine now, these brief moments of solitude when she could get away and let her mind wander, sometimes to the most unexpected places. But this evening felt different. There was a lingering tension in the air, an unspoken sense of foreboding that clung to her like a heavy mist. Gabriella couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. It wasn't just the usual anxiety she had come to expect from the unpredictable nature of her life. No, this felt like something much more serious. Something that had been set in motion the moment she'd crossed paths with Leonardo Rocco. She locked the door behind her and started down the familiar path to her car when the sudden screech of tires on asphalt broke the evening silence. Her heart raced as a black SUV came to a sharp halt in front of her, the engine purring with the quiet menace of a predator waiting to strike. Before she could react, the door to the SUV swung open, and two men in dark suits emerged, moving swiftly toward her car. They weren't looking for a confrontation, they were looking to take her, and they were fast, too fast for her to even process the danger before it was nearly too late. The larger of the two men grabbed her by the wrist, pulling her toward the vehicle with brutal force. Gabriella's pulse surged, panic rising in her throat. Her instincts screamed for her to fight back, but the grip on her arm tightened, and she knew she wouldn't win this fight alone. In that moment, her thoughts raced to Leonardo, the life she had stepped into, the empire she had barely begun to understand. It was real, and now it was closing in on her. The Sicilian Cosa Nostra, the rival mafia family, had finally made their move. They knew too much about her connection to Leonardo, and they saw her as the perfect leverage to get to him. Gabriella's world spun as she struggled against the grip of her captors. Her mind raced, but there was little she could do. She had no weapons, no allies in sight, just the cold, ruthless men who had made her the target of their game. She could hear muffled voices coming from inside the SUV as they prepared to pull her into the vehicle. "Let go of me," she hissed, her voice shaky but defiant. But the man didn't flinch. He only tightened his hold, pulling her closer to the vehicle. The other man moved quickly to the passenger side, waiting to force her in. Gabriella's heart hammered in her chest, and she felt an overwhelming sense of helplessness. Then, as if the universe had shifted, a sleek black car screeched around the corner, tires screeching as it came to an abrupt halt. A figure stepped out, Leonardo. His tall, commanding presence cut through the night like a blade, his eyes scanning the scene with calculated precision. He moved like a predator, every step measured, every action deliberate. The two men hesitated, momentarily distracted by the arrival of their new adversary. But before they could react, Leonardo spoke. His voice was cold, measured, yet unmistakably dangerous. "Let her go." There was no question in his tone, no room for negotiation. The words landed with the force of a command, and for a split second the men seemed to hesitate, weighing their options. They had been instructed to take Gabriella, to use her as leverage, but they hadn't anticipated Leonardo's sudden appearance. Leonardo took another step forward, his eyes never leaving the two men. "I don't think you fully understand what you've just done." The two Sicilian men exchanged a glance. They had heard the rumors about Leonardo Rocco, the fear he inspired, the ruthless power he wielded, but they were confident in their orders, and they had no intention of backing down now. "You don't scare us, Rocco," the larger man said, his voice gruff. "This is bigger than you. Bigger than your empire." Leonardo's lips curved into a slow, almost predatory smile. "That's where you're wrong." His voice dropped, a hint of menace underlying his every word. "You've just made a mistake." In the next instant, Leonardo's bodyguards were out of the car, swiftly closing the gap. The men who had grabbed Gabriella hesitated no more. With swift precision, Leonardo's team moved in, and the two Sicilian men were disarmed and taken to the ground, immobilized in seconds. The larger of the two men struggled, but it was useless. The fight was over before it had even begun. Gabriella stood there, trembling, her hand still gripped in the larger man's tight hold, but now she was free. Leonardo was at her side in an instant, his eyes scanning her as though checking for any signs of injury. His gaze softened when he saw the fear in her eyes. "You're safe now," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "They won't touch you again." Gabriella couldn't speak, couldn't process what had just happened. She had been seconds away from being pulled into a world she couldn't escape from. And then there he was, Leonardo Rocco, arriving just in time, a silent force of nature. Leonardo's gaze shifted toward the two men on the ground, his expression hardening. "Get them out of here. Make sure they never return to this city." Gabriella didn't know what to think. The adrenaline had subsided, but her heart was still racing. She felt like a pawn in a game she didn't fully understand, a game that had just turned violent and personal. "I'm fine," she said, her voice shaky, "but I don't understand. Why me? Why would they want to kidnap me?" Leonardo's face hardened, his jaw clenching. He took a deep breath, clearly trying to maintain his usual calm. "They know about you and me," he said simply. "The Cosa Nostra is watching us, watching you." Gabriella's stomach twisted. "They're using me to get to you," she murmured. Leonardo nodded. "Yes, but they made a grave mistake." He turned away from her for a moment, his mind already calculating his next move. "We're not going to fight them the way they expect. I'm not going to spill more blood. Not for this." Gabriella looked at him, confusion in her eyes. "What are you going to do?" He paused, then looked back at her, his expression hard. "I'm offering them peace." Her eyebrows furrowed. "Peace?" Leonardo's lips curled into a dark smile. "Instead of war, instead of retaliation, I'm going to offer them something they can't refuse." He glanced at the two men, now lying helpless on the ground, being restrained by his bodyguards. "I'm offering them a complete withdrawal from the Sicilian ports in exchange for your protection, for your father's safety. No more trouble, no more threats." Gabriella shook her head, incredulous. "You can't be serious. You're going to give up territory? The Cosa Nostra will never accept that." Leonardo met her gaze, his eyes steady. "They will. They'll have to. It will cost me millions, and it will cost me some respect with my own men, but I don't care. You matter more than any of this." Her heart fluttered with a mixture of disbelief and something she couldn't quite place. She was no longer just a pawn in this dangerous world. She had become a catalyst for change. "But why, Leonardo? Why me?" He didn't answer right away. His gaze drifted to the darkened sky above, as if searching for the right words. Finally he spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "Because you're the first person to ever make me question this life I've built. The first person to make me think there's something worth saving, something beyond the empire." Gabriella stood there, stunned by the honesty in his words. In that moment she realized how much had shifted between them. She wasn't just a woman caught in his world. She had become someone who mattered to him, someone who had caused him to question everything he had lived for. As the night fell over Lake Como, Gabriella's heart remained heavy with the realization that her world had changed in an instant. What had started as a casual encounter with a dangerous man had turned into something deeper, something she hadn't expected to be part of. And now Leonardo Rocco had made a choice. He had chosen her over his empire, signaling a shift in everything he had known. She didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was certain. Everything, from this point forward, would be different. The morning after the tense confrontation with the Cosa Nostra was quieter than Gabriella expected. The weight of the night's events, the kidnapping attempt, Leonardo's sudden shift in priorities, it all hung over her like a fog she couldn't shake. She had barely slept, and when the early light of dawn filtered through the curtains of her modest apartment, Gabriella knew that something had to change. For the first time in weeks, she felt the pull of something more personal, something that transcended her connection to Leonardo's world of power, violence, and secrets. She couldn't keep living in two separate worlds. The truth was, she was already too far in. She was intertwined with a man who was slowly dismantling the empire he'd built, and she was part of it now, whether she liked it or not. But there was still one part of her life she hadn't fully shared with him, one part that, despite everything, still felt untouched by the chaos. Her father. Leonardo had seen the shadows of her world, the small, quiet life she lived in between flights, the way she cared for her father, the sacrifices she made. But he had never truly met the man who had raised her, the man whose illness now weighed heavily on her every decision. Gabriella knew that it was time for him to meet Marco Dante. If she was to continue down this path with Leonardo, he had to understand the importance of family, of what it meant to be loyal to someone outside the dangerous world he controlled. And so, she picked up her phone and dialed his number, the same number she had saved months ago, now a lifeline that had come to mean more than just an invitation to a flight. "Leonardo," she said, her voice steady but carrying a weight of its own. "I need to ask you something important." Leonardo was in the middle of reviewing documents in his office when Gabriella's call came through. Her voice on the other end, calm and unshakable, surprised him. She had always been the one to stand her ground, to challenge him, but this time he could hear the seriousness in her tone. "Of course, Gabriella. What is it?" Gabriella paused for a moment before answering, gathering her thoughts. She had thought long and hard about this. There were risks involved, but she couldn't move forward with her life until this had been settled. "I need you to meet my father," she said, the words flowing from her more easily than she had expected. "I want you to come to my apartment. I need you to meet him, to understand why he matters to me." Leonardo's initial reaction was one of surprise, though he masked it quickly. This wasn't something he had expected to hear. Gabriella had kept her family life somewhat separate from him, intentionally, he assumed. But now, here she was, asking him to meet her father, a simple working-class man who, as far as he knew, had no idea who Leonardo was, let alone the darkness that surrounded him. I don't know if that's a good idea, Gabriella," he replied, his voice tinged with hesitation. "Your father, he doesn't know anything about who I am, the life I lead, the people I deal with. He doesn't deserve to be dragged into this." "I'm not asking you to introduce him to my world, Leonardo," Gabriella answered, her voice firm. "I'm asking you to see the man who raised me, the one who's been there for me when no one else was. My father isn't involved in your world, and I intend to keep it that way. But if we're going to go forward, you need to understand why I can't just leave him behind." Leonardo was silent for a moment, considering her words. He had never been good with family. His own father had been distant. His mother had been protective but absent, and he had long since abandoned any idea of real connection. He had learned to build walls around himself, isolating himself from those who mattered. The idea of introducing himself to a man like Marco Dante, a man who had no knowledge of his empire, was unsettling. But Gabriella's plea was one he couldn't ignore. She had asked him for this, and as much as he hated the idea, he knew this was a crucial step. If he was to remain in her life, if they were to have any future together, he would need to prove that he was capable of understanding her world, even if it meant stepping outside the safety of his own. "All right," he said, after a long pause. "I'll come, but on one condition." Gabriella raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What's that?" "No guards, no security, just me." Gabriella's heart skipped a beat. Leonardo was offering to step into her world, without the walls that kept him protected, without the fear of being watched. It was a risk, a big one, but it spoke volumes. For the first time, it felt like he was willing to let down his guard completely. "Okay," she said softly, the weight of his words sinking in. "I'll see you soon." The next evening, Leonardo arrived at Gabriella's apartment in Lakewood, a quiet residential area just on the outskirts of the city. Gabriella had prepared for this moment for days, setting everything in motion, arranging for her father to be home when Leonardo arrived. She had no idea how this meeting would go, but she knew it had to happen. Her father, Marco, was sitting in his favorite chair near the window when she entered the living room. His eyes were tired and his hands shook slightly as he adjusted the collar of his shirt. Parkinson's had slowly taken away the man he had been, but in his eyes, Gabriella could still see the love and wisdom that had shaped her growing up. She kissed his cheek as she approached him. "Dad," she said softly, "there's someone I want you to meet." She glanced toward the door where Leonardo stood, waiting just outside the threshold. He had no bodyguards, no imposing presence, just a man standing in the doorway, looking uncomfortably out of place in this simple home. Marco looked up at her, his brow furrowed in confusion, then turned his gaze to Leonardo. He was silent for a long moment, studying the man who had become such an important part of Gabriella's life, at least in ways he couldn't fully understand. Leonardo stepped forward, extending a hand, his usual self-assurance softened by the simple nature of the situation. "Mr. Dante, it's a pleasure to meet you," he said, his voice steady but respectful. Marco hesitated before shaking his hand, the tremor in his fingers betraying his nerves. "You're the one Gabriella's been working with," he said slowly, his voice rough. I've heard things about you, but you're not the kind of man I expected to see here." Gabriella felt a knot form in her stomach, the tension thick in the air as the two men stood there, sizing each other up. She had expected the hesitation. Her father had heard the whispers about Leonardo's criminal empire, and he was cautious. But there was something else in his eyes, too. Something that Gabriella could see clearly, something that made her heart swell. Her father, despite everything, was giving this man a chance. "I know I'm not what you were expecting," Leonardo said, his tone calm but firm, "but I'm here because of Gabriella. She's important to me, Mr. Dante. I respect the life you've given her, and I understand that it's not a life I'm accustomed to, but I care for her, more than you might think." Marco studied him for a moment longer, then looked at his daughter. "I see," he said slowly. "I see why you care for him, Gabriella, but I don't know if I can approve of what he does, what he's done." Gabriella's heart pounded as the room seemed to hold its breath. "Dad, I'm not asking you to approve of everything," she said, her voice steady but soft. "But I need you to understand that this man, Leonardo, he's different with me. I see something in him that I can't ignore, and I need you to see that too." Marco was silent for a long while, his gaze flicking between his daughter and the man before him. He could see the sincerity in Gabriella's eyes, the deep affection she had for Leonardo. Finally he sighed, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. "You've always made your own decisions, Gabriella," he said quietly, his voice full of resignation. "I can't stop you from being with him, but I need to know that he's not going to hurt you, that whatever happens, he'll protect you." Leonardo nodded solemnly, the gravity of the words settling over him. "I will, Mr. Dante. I'll protect her. I give you my word." Marco studied him for another moment, then finally gave a slight nod. "Then I give you my blessing. But understand this, Rocco. If you ever hurt her, I'll make sure you regret it." Gabriella exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The weight of her father's approval, the recognition that he saw something in Leonardo worth trusting, was more than she had hoped for. And for the first time, Leonardo seemed genuinely moved, his usual stoic expression giving way to something softer, almost grateful. "Thank you," Leonardo said quietly, the words carrying more sincerity than Gabriella had ever heard from him. As the two men exchanged one last look, Gabriella felt the invisible wall between their worlds begin to crack. This meeting, this fragile connection between her past and her future, had started to form a bridge, one that she wasn't sure how to cross, but one she was willing to try. For the first time, it felt like they were on the same page. And in that moment, Gabriella knew that everything was about to change. The morning mist hung low over Lake Como, casting a serene veil across the water that glittered in the early light. The small villa at the edge of the lake stood quiet, its stone walls bathed in the soft glow of the sun just beginning to rise over the distant mountains. The air smelled faintly of pine and fresh earth, a sharp contrast to the world Gabriella had recently become entangled in, a world of power, secrets, and violence. Yet here, in this tranquil setting, the chaos of her life felt distant, almost manageable. 6 months had passed since the kidnapping attempt, since the moment Leonardo had chosen her over his empire. That night her world had irrevocably shifted. The sense of vulnerability she had once carried had slowly faded, replaced by a quiet certainty that despite the shadows that lingered, there was a path forward for them. But the road ahead was far from simple, and today she was about to take another step into the unknown. The commitment ceremony, though intimate, was not without its own weight. It wasn't a wedding, at least not in the traditional sense, but for Gabriella and Leonardo, it represented something just as profound, a promise to navigate the labyrinth of their lives together. It wasn't just about love or the passionate connection they shared. It was about facing the reality of their pasts, the decisions, the darkness, the compromises, and choosing to move forward anyway. As Gabriella stood in front of the villa, dressed in a simple, elegant white gown that contrasted sharply with the formality of Leonardo's black suit. She felt a sense of peace. It was the kind of calm that only came when everything else in her life had felt like a storm. This moment, surrounded by a handful of close friends, was theirs alone. A sanctuary. Leonardo stood by her side, his presence unwavering as always. Yet today there was something softer about him. The hard lines of his face, the permanent tension in his posture, had relaxed in the presence of the lake, the silence of the ceremony. There were no grand declarations, no extravagant gestures, just the quiet promise of a future built together. Leonardo's eyes met Gabriella's, his gaze intense yet filled with something she hadn't seen in him before, vulnerability. I stand here before you, Gabriella, knowing that everything I have built, everything I have fought for, has been for a purpose I thought was the right one. But in the end, I understand now that it was all about survival, about protecting what I thought was mine. But you... He paused, his voice thick with emotion. You made me realize that there's something more than all of this, more than power and fear. There's something worth fighting for that I never understood until you came into my life. Gabriella felt her chest tighten at his words. The weight of them, the sincerity, was something she could no longer ignore. She had always known there was more to Leonardo than the man he appeared to be, more than the mafia boss, the ruler of empires. She had seen it in the way he opened up to her, in the quiet moments when he allowed her to see past the armor he wore every day. I've made mistakes, Gabriella, Leonardo continued, his voice low but steady, and I will continue to make them. The empire I've built is a part of me, but it's also something I want to change. I'm committed to transitioning it, to making it legitimate, to stepping away from the darkness and into the light. For you, for us. The silence that followed his words was thick, filled with the weight of unspoken promises and the understanding that their journey was far from over. Gabriella knew that the path ahead wouldn't be easy. The empire Leonardo had built wasn't something that could be dismantled overnight. But the fact that he was willing to try, that he was willing to change for her, was a promise in itself. It was more than she had ever hoped for when she first crossed paths with him. Gabriella reached for his hand, the warmth of his touch grounding her as she squeezed it gently. I don't need perfection, Leonardo, she said softly, her voice steady but filled with conviction. I don't need you to be someone you're not. I just need you to be here, to choose this with me. Choose us. And I promise I'll choose you too. Leonardo's gaze softened, and for a moment, the weight of his past seemed to lift from his shoulders, if only just for a brief second. He nodded, his hand tightening around hers. Then we will do this together, he said, his voice full of quiet determination. And no matter what comes, we'll face it together. As they exchanged their vows, their words were simple but laden with meaning. They weren't binding them to anything grand, but to something deeper, something that transcended the empire and the chaos that had defined their lives up until this point. It was a promise to grow, to rebuild, to be vulnerable with each other, even when the world around them demanded that they remain guarded. The ceremony was small, no grand fanfare, just a few close allies and friends, and the two of them standing side by side in the quiet stillness of Lake Como, making a promise that would shape their future. For Gabriella, it was a moment of clarity. She wasn't just marrying a man, she was committing herself to the possibility of a future that was still uncertain but full of potential. And for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of hope she hadn't known she was missing. After the vows, they shared a quiet moment by the water, their hands intertwined as they looked out at the serene lake. The world around them was calm, the ripples on the surface reflecting the peace that for once felt attainable. Gabriella rested her head on Leonardo's shoulder, allowing herself a moment of peace in the midst of everything. We'll have to work hard, won't we? Gabriella said softly, her voice almost a whisper. Leonardo chuckled, his lips brushing the top of her head. Yes, he agreed. But nothing worth having comes easy. Gabriella smiled, feeling the weight of the commitment she had made settle into her chest. This was their new beginning, one that came with uncertainty but also with promise. It was a commitment to change, to growth, and to each other. But as the ceremony ended, Leonardo's words from earlier echoed in her mind. The empire I've built is a part of me. It would take time to rebuild, to shift from power to legitimacy. There would be obstacles, certainly, and there would be moments when they both questioned whether it was all worth it. But in that moment, standing by his side, Gabriella knew she had made the right choice. For the first time, they both had something to work toward, something worth fighting for. And as they looked out over the calm waters of Lake Como, Gabriella knew that the journey ahead, no matter how difficult, was one she would face with him, together. The future wasn't certain, but for the first time, it felt like they were moving toward something real, something that could withstand the chaos of their past. And in that small, intimate ceremony, surrounded by those who mattered most, Gabriella and Leonardo made a vow not just to each other, but to the possibility of a new life, one built on hope, redemption, and the promise that love could still thrive in the unlikeliest of places. 1 year later, a full year had passed since the commitment ceremony at Lake Como, a year since the kidnapping attempt, since the moment Leonardo had made his decision to change, to choose her over the empire he had spent his entire life building. And in that year, so much had changed. Gabriella stood at the front of the airplane, feeling the familiar hum of the engines beneath her feet, the same hum that had once been a source of quiet comfort and routine. But now, everything was different. She was no longer the woman who had merely carried trays and served meals at 30,000 feet. No, she was a senior flight attendant now, a leader in the cabin, trusted by her colleagues and respected by her passengers. Her life had taken a new direction. Leonardo's empire, once a dark, imposing structure of criminality and power, was slowly being dismantled. The dark corners that had defined his existence were being peeled back layer by layer as he worked to transition to legitimate business ventures. His transformation, however slow and painful, had taken root, and Gabriella had been at his side through it all, as he had been at hers. They had both faced challenges, both internal and external, but their bond had only grown stronger. Today, though, Gabriella was testing something else. She had chosen to work a flight, a long-haul trip to New York, to see how far she had come, to see how far their relationship had truly evolved. It wasn't about the destination or the passengers. This flight for her was a test, a way to measure the distance between where they had started and where they were now. The flight had begun like any other. The cabin crew went through the usual motions of preparing the cabin, ensuring that everything was in place for a smooth journey. Gabriella moved through the aisles, checking on the passengers, offering warm smiles and making small talk, but her mind was elsewhere, focused on the task ahead. When the boarding process was complete and the last of the passengers settled into their seats, Gabriella noticed something, or rather, someone. From the corner of her eye, she saw him, Leonardo. He was seated in first class, his dark suit sharp and impeccable, his usual commanding presence radiating even from the back of the plane. But today there was something different about him. He had changed, there was no doubt about it. The man who had once been a ghost of power, consumed by his empire and the weight of his past, now seemed lighter. His eyes, which had once been cold and distant, were warm with an understanding that hadn't been there before. Gabriella paused, feeling a surge of emotion that she had long since learned to keep in check. She took a deep breath and approached him. "Signor Rocco," she said, her voice steady, despite the flutter in her chest. "It's good to see you again." Leonardo looked up, his eyes softening as they met hers. "Gabriella," he said, his voice warm and familiar, "it's been a while." They exchanged a knowing smile, one that spoke of their shared history, the journey they had walked together over the past year. As Gabriella prepared to go through her usual pre-flight announcements, something unexpected happened. She found herself speaking to him in Italian, a language that had once been a barrier but now felt like their own. "How's the flight so far?" she asked in Italian, her words flowing naturally, comfortably. Leonardo's eyes glinted with approval, a subtle smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Better now," he replied in perfect Italian, his accent smooth, his voice carrying the same depth it always did. As they spoke, Gabriella realized that something had shifted, not just in their relationship, but in themselves. The language they shared now was not just a means of communication. It had become a symbol of their connection, a bridge that spanned the chasm between their worlds. The same language that had once kept Leonardo isolated was now the language of understanding and love between them. They spoke for a while longer, reminiscing about their journey, how their worlds had collided in ways neither could have predicted. They talked about the fear and uncertainty they had both felt when they first stepped into this complicated relationship. But more than that, they spoke of the future, of what they were building together, piece by piece, despite the chaos that still loomed on the edges of their lives. The conversation was light, free of the weight of their pasts, for the first time in a long while. It felt like something new, something they could own together. As the flight progressed, Gabriella moved through the cabin, her mind returning to the path she had chosen. She had never been naive about the risks, about the dangers that still lurked in the shadows of their lives. But in this moment, as she reflected on everything they had been through, she couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet pride. They had made it this far, together. Leonardo, too, had undergone a transformation. The man who had once commanded fear was now standing before her, vulnerable and open. He had begun testifying against former associates, helping to dismantle the empire he had built. The mafia connections, the violent methods, it was all slowly being replaced by legitimate business ventures. The process was slow, agonizingly slow, and had cost him more than he had ever expected. But Leonardo was committed to change, not just for himself, but for her, for them. "Do you ever wonder," Gabriella asked him during one of their quiet moments, "if we're ever going to be free of all this? The danger, the shadows?" Leonardo's eyes darkened for a moment, but he nodded. "Maybe not free," he said quietly, "but I've come to understand that freedom isn't the absence of fear. It's the ability to choose despite it." Gabriella looked out at the clouds passing beneath them, her thoughts drifting. "I think I understand," she said softly. "I've made choices too, and every day I choose this life, this, us." Leonardo leaned forward, his hand finding hers. "Then we'll continue making those choices together." As the plane descended toward its destination, Gabriella couldn't help but feel that, in some strange way, they had come full circle. The woman who had once served trays at 30,000 feet, caught between two worlds, had found a place where she truly belonged. And Leonardo, the man who had spent decades building an empire of fear, had found redemption not just in his actions, but in the love they shared. Language, Gabriella thought, wasn't just about words. It was about hearing someone everyone else had decided wasn't worth understanding. And in that moment, as they sat together, speaking softly in Italian, Gabriella knew she had made the right choice. Despite the uncertainties of the world they still lived in, they had found something real. Together, they had learned to speak the language of love, and for the first time it felt like the only language that truly mattered. Appreciate you staying till the end. The next story's even crazier. More twists, more drama. Don't miss it. Click the video on your screen and jump right in.